Hi everyone, good evening for the ones here and the ones at home. I'm Rui Costa, I'm the director of the Zuckerman Institute, and it's really a pleasure to see you all in person here. I think it's the first full house we have. When we invited Julie Mehretu to join us, we had in mind a very different times, but I'm very thankful that we're all here in person and that we're going to have this special event of our Alan Kanzer Artist in Residence program. So this program aims to build bridges between neuroscience and creative expression, to strengthen our links to the community and inspire a bidirectional dialogue between scientists and artists that hopefully will lead to the generation of new perspectives in our own brains and have a positive impact on society. I would like to thank, Alan Kanzer, who is our Brain Trust member and has been an avid supporter of our science and established these Artist in Residence programs, is watching us from home. Hi, Alan. Thank you so much. Your support of interdisciplinarity has allowed us to have amazing people like Julie Mehretu, Sarah Z, Nicole Krause, Claire Massoud. So tonight, I'm really excited about this special event entitled The Brain and Perception, Views from a Scientist and an Artist, featuring our artist in residence, Julie Mehretu, and our scientist, Charles Zuker. Julie Mehretu is one of the greatest artists of our times. She was born in Ethiopia and lives and works in New York City, sometimes in Berlin, sometimes all over the world. Julie received a Master's of Fine Art with honors from Rhode Island School of Design and is the recipient of many awards, including the MacArthur Award, the U.S. Department of State Medal of Arts Award, and she was named one of Time Magazine's most influential people, 100 most influential people in 2020, and her work has been really shown extensively, and just in the past years, I've lost count, but LACMA, the Whitney, the High Museum in Atlanta, the Walker Museum of Art in Minneapolis. But I wanted to state here our profound gratitude to Julie for the time she has at this busy time spent with us at the Institute. Julie has been an incredibly active member of our community, interacting with many of the scientists here and exploring themes such as memory, perception, time, and space that we all love, but from multiple perspectives. She brought us that multidimensionality, depth, unique perspective that she actually shows in her work. So thank you, Julie. And I also want to introduce Charles Zuker. Charles is a scientist. He's a professor of biochemistry and molecular biophysics and neuroscience at the Zuckerman Institute and an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. He has also received many awards for identifying key components of how we sense. In particular, Charles identified the taste cells and the receptors of all 5 basic taste qualities. So sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami, and more recently, actually, how we perceive sweet even in the gut, not in the tongue. But then he went on to reveal the logic of the connection between what we sense in the tongue and what we sense and perceive and feel in the brain, uncovering how the connections actually are formed from the periphery to the brain. And in this way, why is it that some tastings, for example, are very attractive while others are very repulsive? So his work, I think, changed our understanding of sensation, but in a way, he's touching how we go from sensation to the subjective experience of feeling. So we hope you enjoy this event. Please, if you have questions and you're here, wait until the end, raise your arm, ask the question. If you're at home or on YouTube, go to the Q&A or the comment section, and we'll be monitoring those questions throughout the event. Thank you all, and now I'd like to invite first to come to the stage Charles Zuker. Charles, take it away.
First, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Great. It's really refreshing and invigorating to meet once again in person. Now, we are at the Zuckerman Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute. And so we thought that a good way to start the program would be perhaps to start with the brain. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give a 10 to 15 minute intro into detection and perception. I was going to talk about some of my work, but after Rui's introduction, I don't think there is a need to cover any of my own research. So that will save us another 4 minutes there. And then Julie will give a presentation. And then we're going to start our conversation, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time then to engage the audience. They disturb me. The sound of Mozart. The touch of a mother's hand. The taste of foie gras. The scent of a grandson. And of course, the sight of a beautiful painting. These are our senses, and their role is to create an internal representation, a map, if you will, of the physical and chemical features of the outside world. Now, the detectors at the periphery that sense the world are specialized cells, in general neurons, that sense physical and chemical stimuli. For example, light, sound, smell, taste, pain, and touch. And we should add pleasure here. One of our investigators here works on neurons that actually sense physical pleasure. Now, in essence, these cells, the ones, for example, shown in this cartoon, and I'm going to focus on one of them, which are photoreceptor neurons in your retina, have, in this example here, light-sensing molecules. In fact, they have hundreds of millions of these light-sensing molecules that allow the photoreceptors in your retina to capture photons of light and ultimately transform that into a signal. That is the world of detection. Then that signal goes into your brain, and it gets transformed into perception. Now, for example, we see in color because we have photoreceptors in our retina that detect red, blue, and green, and together they cover the full visible spectrum. It turns out that dogs see the world quite different than us. They do not have red photoreceptors. So this picture here is 3 puppies the way we see them. And this one here is the same 3 puppies, most likely the way they would see themselves. So as you can appreciate, just with this example, our view of the world only exists in our mind. And the very nature of the sensors an animal possesses will define the kind of physical and chemical cues they may recognize and ultimately transform it into a perceived action and behaviors. In fact, each species lives in its own sensory world, of which other species may be either partially or more often than not totally unaware of. Now, for example, barn owls are active principally at night and use minute differences in the timing and level of sound as it arrives between the 2 ears, they're slightly offset, to triangulate and localize prey in total darkness with extraordinary precision. This is nothing short of remarkable. Now, what you're looking at this slide is a multiple exposure of an owl hunting in the dark, taken using an infrared camera. Now, owls cannot see infrared light, and so this bird is using auditory cues alone to locate the mouse, shown here in that circle red, and guide his strike. Now, we cannot see in the infrared either, but there is an entire world of species that do see in the infrared. And I think the best examples are pit vipers, boas, and pythons, that they have infrared receptors, that's their sensors, in a dedicated organ, shown right here. Do you see my cursor, by the way? Kind of, yeah? Known as the pit organ, that detects the heat signature of prey and then transmit the information to the visual cortex, where they now construct an internal image. So this animal actually see heat. So you could really realize how different species see and perceive only a fraction of the richness of the outside world, and they create their own selective image out of their own sensory inputs. Now, the last example I want to highlight here are bats that living again in complete darkness and use fantastic echolocation to localize objects and prey. Now, I want to use them to illustrate how the senses work together with expectation and experience to guide decision making. Of course, we could do this with examples in humans, but I think it's interesting to reveal how this happens at all levels of our evolutionary scale. Now, what you're seeing here is a moth. This moth is hanging from a wire. This is taken all under, again, an infrared camera. And here's the moth, and here comes the bat. And this bat is using, again, echolocation to localize the sound-emitting moth and eat it. Now, this next image now shows a different moth. The moth hanging here actually uses sound mimicry to emulate the sound of a moth that tastes horrendously bitter. Now, the bat you're going to see here was exposed once to such a horrendously bitter moth. And now, let's see this clip. There is the moth. There it changes the sound. And there comes the bat. Isn't this amazing? Now, the first message I want to convey with just this handful of slides is that the brain then functions by creating its own reality. In essence, its own selective image of the outside world. And each species only experiences a fraction of this world. Now, the second message I want to give you is that our representation of the outside world is very unique and personal. And this is quite relevant as we experience the world of art. And you could prove this with a very simple psychophysical experiment. Turns out that if I project red, blue, and green beams on a screen, I can see not only the red, blue, and green, but I also see the overlap. So now we could do the following experiments. We're going to take 3 projectors. One projector is going to project red light. One is going to project the green light. That together here, they are going to give you a yellow color. And then next to them are going to project a spectrally pure yellow. And I'm going to take anyone from the audience, and I'm going to ask you, take the intensity knobs of these 2 red and green projectors and change each of the beams so you can perfectly match this spectrally pure yellow. Make sense? Very simple psychophysical experiment. And I'm going to write down the numbers in the intensity knobs for your, in this example here, red and green. And then I'm going to call the other 70 people in this room. And guess what I'm going to get? 70 different pairs of numbers. So we all see it as yellow, and we call it yellow. But our percept of that yellow is unique and personal and different for each one of us. And you can extend this very same paradigm to the sense of olfaction, to the sense of taste, and so forth. All right? Now, the next point I want to cover is that context transforms our percepts. And this, again, can be illustrated quite beautifully with very simple examples, and I'm sure many of you have seen this. Here in this image, we see these, all black boxes and lines that go up and down. But of course, in reality, you all know that these lines are perfectly parallel. Now, the next example that illustrates how context completely changed our percepts is this other nice, tricky slide. Can you see the wheels turning? If you focus on these dots in the middle, by the way, the wheels stop moving. Well, this picture is not animated at all. It's your eyes making it move. And if we have time at the end, we can talk about how the brain is playing this trick in your mind. Now, the next point I thought will be fun to illustrate is the fact that percepts are molded by expectation and experience. In essence, our brains fills in the gaps, pattern completion, so to speak. And I think this is nicely illustrated in this next example. Now, if I ask you to tell me what you see here, everyone in this room should say a couple embracing. But if I show the same picture to a large number of very, very young children, every one of them will say that what they see is lots of dolphins. In fact, there are 9 dolphins in this image here. Now, to further bring this point home, I want to now tell you that experience, of course, comes in many forms. And this example here will illustrate the amazing power of experience and expectation in how our brain processes sensory signals even after a single exposure. Okay, remember that bat that forever remember that bitter tasting? All right. Now, this is an example using now the auditory system. Now, what you're going to see here is a cochlear implant that's being used to process a sentence. And the cochlear implant is running in either 1, 4, 8, and 12 channels. It then goes to 20 and the full. And so let's listen. One channel. Four channels.
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
8.
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
12.
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
All right, so I think unless you have super hearing power, the 1, 4, 8, and 12 channels, I believe, should have been practically unintelligible. Now, let's listen again to the same clip. Let's see. 30 seconds after you just heard it. All right? That was to add a bit of drama.
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon? What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
This is the magic of the brain.
What kind of bait do you use to catch salmon?
What kind of bait do you use?
All right, so now I hope in this short, set of slides, you've gotten a feel as to what detection means and what perception represents. Brain versus mind. Now, understanding the brain is the greatest scientific challenge of this generation. Now, thanks to great advances in technology and biology, we are getting remarkable insights into the inner workings and what we like to call the magic of the brain. Now, here at the Zuckerman Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute, we are taking a journey into the center of our thoughts, memories, emotions, and behaviors. We really want to understand how you go from a brain to a mind, from molecules, cells, and circuits, to a thought, an idea, ultimately transforming the human condition. Let me finish this by re-emphasizing Rui's point that the goal of the Artist in Residence program and our Writer in Residence program and our Jazz Artist in Residence program is to bridge the work of neuroscientists with the very people that can so profoundly alter our view of the world with the stroke of a brush, with the writing on a page, with a small tune. How? How do they play with our emotions? That's what we ultimately want to translate. Artists, writers, and musicians help us explore what it means to be human. But of course, it goes well beyond that. They offer a timeless window into our minds and our souls. And who better to illustrate that very point than our own brilliant Julie Mehretu. Julie, the floor is yours. All right.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Let me now bring your PowerPoint. Now I need to stop share. I know they're going to freak out back there, so... Oh, look, there is us. So here you are.
And then we can just start it on the first slide.
Yes, I'm going to do that, but before we do that, we need to go to the Zoom.
Okay.
I need to share screen. I need to go desktop 2. I have to share, and then I have to go back here and put you on presenter view. And that way you see the slide that follows. All right? This is your slide, and this is the one that comes next.
Okay, I want to start with this one.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
Thank you. Well, it's hard to follow that, I have to say. It's such an honor to be here and to have been a part of this community for the last couple of years through a very trying time, but so it's been spread out, the visits, but that's only been to my benefit and the expansiveness of the kind of opportunities of conversations that I've had here with all these different amazing scientists. And it's been an incredible honor, so I want to especially thank the Institute. Can you hear me? Okay, should I speak louder? Should I speak louder? Can you hear me better? Okay, so I just especially want to thank the Institute and especially Charles Zuker for really the amazing hosting and being the kind of my host here, and our connections and conversations over the past few years, and all of you. Thank you again for the wonderful introduction. And so basically what I thought I would do, it's really interesting to follow this idea of perception, right? Like in terms of what Charles said about experience and the sense, having these kind of, the sensual experience of the world throughout our lives and even before we are born, that inform and who we are, and how we engage. And I think that as an artist, that's one of the core kinds of questions that we are negotiating and trying to make sense of, is the world around us and who we are in this world. And for me, that's taken place. I mean, I'm going to try to talk about a lot of these ideas in a very short period of time. So forgive me if some things seem to not make sense. I'm happy to answer any questions after. But for me, that's happened through the process of drawing and painting, primarily. But this was because drawing and painting came very easily to me when I was younger, and meaning that I always drew and I always wanted to create in that way. And there was something that occurred in the process of making with my hand and drawing that if I could get my brain out of the way, something which I mean, like, if I could get the kind of thought process out of the way, I could then maybe possibly do something that was unexpected or interesting. And so my process became one in my earlier years in graduate school of really trying to make sense of, I tried to strip everything down to the most basic mark and make sense of what was I trying to do with that mark. So this became a conglomeration of the same kind of mark, same kind of gesture, 2 circles and a line, and how they interacted could be something that I could try and make sense of, and how they became took on their own identities in a way by the way that they interacted with one another. Different marks then acted differently with each other. And marks are this very, they're part of who we are from the beginning of time, from the beginning of our knowledge of our human beings. We have these traces of ourselves in the world. And a part of that is one of the most interesting, I think, things about being an artist and someone who's being a person in the world is this study of those who have come before us and who have tried to either make sense of us and our experience and emotions in writing, in poetry, in song, in music, and also in mark making. And these are really, really old parts of who we are. They're fundamental to us as human beings. And so, I don't know, that's always been very fascinating to me, but also this desire to take perception and actually generate a different form through that. That's this very kind of ancient part of us, the fundamental part of us. So for me, I think what I'll do is I'll just, rather than go through the whole experience of my paintings, these images are from the show that was here at the Whitney. It is now going to close next weekend in Minneapolis, and then the show began in 2019 in LA. And one of the I guess benefits of pandemic was that it really extended the run of this show. That it should have so that it's still happening, even though it was work from a long time ago. But I thought I would go into one of the early paintings and how I approached it, and then go into a few other paintings as throughout this last 25 years of this work. This was a painting that I made for my first solo exhibition here in New York in 2001. It's called Retopistics, a renegade excavation after de Kooning's excavation, renegade playing with things, retopistics to play with ideas of utopia, but also these ideas of kind of the redo, the remix, and the constant, the way we kind of go through these repeat cycles as human beings. For me, the architectural language was a way to think of as a metaphoric language for systems of power, structures of power, history of thought, social structure, and what is embedded in our desire, social desire in architecture. And you can really look at any building and reduce that to some form of sociality or social thought, political thought. And in that, the kind of history that we've lived in that, the palimpsest we've lived in through that and experienced through that, there's also creates a kind of machine, and it creates a kind of larger mechanism that is way bigger than what we can negotiate. And I think right now that's completely exploded through other forms of infrastructure, like the social media, the internet, and how forms of if you could have a kind of way of trying to think through that, mapping that, or trying to make sense of that, there's almost an impossibility of that project because of the numerous connections. And maybe it works like a little bit like the brain, from what I've learned here. I mean, this vast unknown. But more than what I think is really, really interesting, especially now, is how do we negotiate our reality when each of our realities is not just perceptually different, but our understanding of the world, our actual realities are different. If there's 70 of us in here, that each of us have a completely different understanding of the world through these mediated experiences that we have. They're fractured in a way that they have never been before. And that's this new form of trying to make sense of ourselves. And I think this was on the kind of utopic side of that, the rise of that. This was early, like email was just something, right? Like you just got our email addresses. This was before, like, you know, everyone had cell phones in the way that they do. So this was a long, you know, this was a very different optimistic perspective of the world. It was also a painting that I worked on right before the World Trade Center attack. And so this was also a moment of American kind of international globalization, like optimism about globalized kind of engagement, and this very outward optimistic global order that the United States was very engaged in, and that completely and immediately fundamentally shifted after 9/11 and after that attack. You had a very different reality that came out of that. And so for me, this painting is this kind of marker. I actually finished it before 9/11, but it was shown in November of 2001, and in that sense, it's really kind of haunting that there's all these explosions of buildings. The characters of the mark making that are inside of the painting that are hard to see for you, but you have to trust me here. If you've seen them in person, you'll see it's filled with all these little marks of drawings and these different characters behaving in different ways. And they're the kind of, you know, contagion in the machine. They're also the battling the architecture. They're trying to restructure the space and create a different way of seeing it. And in person, I think you have that experience very differently. The scale of this painting is 16 feet by 8 feet, 8.5 feet, something like that. And so it's really an immersive experience when you have this physical experience of the painting. And the marks, how they move, march, create, you know, digest the space, battle the space, they create a different kind of spatial experience in the painting. So there's this question as to how does can the mark be co-opted by the machine, or can the mark affect the machine? Can the mark shift the machine? Can, like, what power does the mark have in this larger kind of network? And this is, I think, fundamentally was, like, in a way, a sense of playing with the emergence of, this new form of technology, but at the same time, and trying to make sense of this new form of technology, but at the same time, the kind of visceral sense of not having agency as an individual within that, and yet the kind of deeper experiential belief in your individual agency. And so these kinds of questions around the collective and the whole and the individual's kind of role in that, and societally how we engage in that. And I think in this society we really privilege a certain type of individualism and individualist desire as opposed to what is a collective kind of interest or something. And so and sometimes the argument is that individuals desire in service of that collective, but it becomes this very complicated kind of questions. And I think that for me, it was a way to play with this and try and give these marks some agency, or like see the power of their agency. And that became kind of this project that I started to really follow for I don't know, years. I really built this visual archive of all different kinds of images of a historic past, of our collective historic past, kind of a social past of all different forms, and created paintings that questioned this in all different ways, like tried to approach the paintings conceptually from different points of departure, but at the same time to not have a visual kind of imaginary of what this image would be, what the painting would be. It was really through the experience of making the painting that the painting materialized. And then it's so interesting how afterwards you can kind of make these other associations with what that painting viscerally brings up in terms of physical understandings, visceral understandings of memory, space, sound, smell, how these paintings are not pictures of something, but they're experiences. They become, my interest in them is in their experiential possibility, in what happens in the time-based experience of the painting. And so then I moved on to map these paintings, to map what was taking place in the paintings. I started to look at different forms of architecture that emerged at really particular moments in time. In 2011, I focused a lot on the kind of really contagious global uprisings that we saw take place from revolutions all over, from Cairo to Tunisia, Cairo, all over North Africa. We still having a civil war in Syria as a repercussion, as something that came out of this. But these kinds of actions were contagious. Turkey, Mexico, this country, France, it went everywhere, this kind of action, and Brazil. And so one of the things I wanted to try and look at then, I was invited to participate in Documenta, was the history of the public square as a witness to these kinds of actions, but also as a vessel that's created not necessarily for the public square, but as not just a witness, but as something that was generated by by the history of the same collective people that are in uprising or in revolution or in revolt inside of them. This kind of the complexities of those positions, but also the kind of complexity of the repeat position of that kind of a gesture. That our imagination, or that imaginatory space, that's the gesture of change or social change. And to me, there is this kind of I just wanted to really make sense of that, because it was really this kind of interesting, but also really pessimistic maybe, but that's not the right word, but there's this liminal space during those moments of revolution, where there's this kind of euphoric hope, euphoric kind of contagious feeling. But in anyone who's really experienced this kind of gesture, it usually results in more turmoil, more hardship, more kind of devastation. And Egypt is a perfect example of that. If you look at what happened in Cairo and the history of what happened in Egypt with the revolution, if you look at where I come from, Ethiopia, and what happened after the revolution, and the efforts of many different kind of disparate parts in those gestures and how they become co-opted, this becomes like, you know, the Green Revolution in Iran. Like, this is not necessarily a new thing. And, you know, you can go all the way back to Paris for that, or to France. And so I was super interested in thinking about these spaces, these kind of buildings, and the history of them, and the way they become, how they are connected to those gestures, but how they are also these witnesses of a different moment in time. But then they're also, so they're agents in a way. But the agents are also, and the agency is by the gestures that are happening inside that social space, inside that sociality, and so that created a whole group of paintings. And the more that I kept working on those paintings, and I think if you look at them in detail, this is a detail of one area where you can actually see what that building is. You can see the balconies, and these are all hand-drawn in the paintings, but from projected photographs. And I work with some amazing artists who work with me, who were able to, through a lot of work together, were able to transcribe these, trace these kind of drawings, and create drawings that you really can't see in full detail. And so none of this is done by a computer or with CAD. It's all just drawn. And I think that adds something very interesting to the way that you work through and perceive and experience these paintings. But the more that I was working with this architectural language, and the more that they started to layer over one another and they would start to obstruct each other, it became this other form of palimpsest or grid, but it also, there became a certain illegibility in that, which I found really interesting, right? That time becomes something that's confounding, and that these contradictions kind of degenerate each other in a way. But what I also became really interested in is what happens when you leave that grid completely, when the drawing really is liberated from that space. It doesn't need that narrative or that information to actually be able to create something else and to generate these kinds of questions. And I think a big kind of internal shift that happened for me was the expected and resultant co-option of the revolution in Cairo, and how that in Egypt, and how there became, it's really weird. Like, I went into this period of making very dark gray paintings and these kind of these dark blurred images, and they came out of this, you know, if you think about it politically, these were painted, you know, and it'll make more sense later what I'm saying, but these were painted during the Obama years of the American president, the American moment, which was a very different and optimistic kind of moment politically and socially than what we experienced in 2016 with the 45th president. But what happens with those paintings is they completely go back to the kind of some form of intense color. So it's interesting that I went into this place of darkness and grayness during this time, but for me it was really in response to the kind of co-option and devastation that came out of that emancipatory desire of the revolutions in 2011, 2012, and onwards. And so that became like just an interesting place to think about these kind of, I'm sorry I don't have a closer image of it, but these kind of paintings where the drawing and what happens in the drawing and the gesture, what is suggested by that, the erasure of that, the kind of emergence of bodies in that, the emergence of a certain kind of visceral feeling that could be experienced, is really happening because of the marks and because of this other space, and that there is a certain kind of place of invention in that for another possibility. And I think this was always what I was doing inside of the drawing in the architecture, but perceptually, there became, when you look at these, no matter how close you get to those marks, and those marks collectively become larger gestures and affect the visual kind of experience of, and your perceptual experience of the painting, but they also, they're always scaled to a certain degree because of our knowledge of what we can decipher, whether it's the scale of one of those small windows and a mark that all of a sudden makes us really far, or gives us this really far sense of visuality of what we're seeing. And I wanted a much more immersive experience inside of these, to try and move to somewhere like that. We moved into then, you know, these last years. This painting is made in 2018. It's called Hineni, which means "here I am," and it's what Moses responded to God's calling in the burning bush. When God called Moses, and his response in Hebrew was Hineni in the Old Testament, and then also again when who is it that sacrificed Isaac? Joseph, thank you. Joseph was called by God, and also responded to Hineni. And so,
Isaac, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Isaac was the son.
Was the son. Abraham was.
Abraham, thank you. Yeah, I didn't think it was Joseph. Sorry, I realize now. I wasn't thinking. I was just going on. Yeah, Abraham. Thank you. And when Abraham was called by God to you know, and when Abraham responded, it was also Hineni. And I thought that's just. You know, there's an interesting kind of space in this, and it came out of also this is in the book of Exodus, with the story about Moses and the burning bush. And the book of Exodus has been a really important project for me and a few other artists that I work with as a collective for Denniston Hill, which is this artist collective, think tank, nonprofit project that we have together, artist residency project. But really it's this place of collective study, of creative kind of making, and trying to negotiate like the world that we're in, but really what are our intentions, and also how can we creatively think of sustainable futures together. So it exists in many ways outside of painting, but the Exodus project, or the concept, the ontological thought, the concept of Exodus, is really interesting to us at the last 5 years, and continuing to work with this idea and really study it through a reading group and through a lot of work in collaborative work with other artists. But it's the idea of the kind of, not the arrival at the promised land, but the kind of those years of loss in the desert, the years of the moment post-emancipation, that the complexity and the contradictions inherent in that. In the Old Testament, they refer to them as kind of the murmurings in the desert, and this kind of place of unknowing. And how do we how does one negotiate a future after liberation that doesn't necessarily remake a form of oppression or repression, or this form of slavery? And so this moment, that liminal space, that time in the desert, those 40 years, that's kind of the space we want to investigate, and we are in the midst of investigating. And so to me, I had already created this painting. It was an image of, based off of the various images of wildfires in California. At the time, there were also many other kinds of fires happening globally that were in the media a lot. Rohingya. The burning of Rohingya villages in Myanmar, the wildfires in California and Australia, and we had this very kind of intense year with fire, and it was at that point the largest fires in 2018. We've gone past that since, but so it's this blurred image of this fire that we painted in the studio, and I started to use these kind of blurred images of media, of images that I would get through the media, but I would use these as a point of departure, as, again, a different form of social ground, right? Like, if the architectural was a form of social ground, really the kind of ground we all are immersed in, then these paintings, the blurred image of this, the kind of, you don't know that that's necessarily a fire, because it doesn't but there's this, but it can be that, but it can also be in its color and in its kind of in the experience of that. this can also be a painting of blackness, or this can be a painting that brings up a kind of visceral, embodied experience of trauma. This can be a painting that can, in terms of the language, that can be also a painting of a form of exorcism. So there's these different kinds of aspects or modalities that can be experienced in these, and those are so subjective, which I think relates so much to what Charles was speaking about in the talk, this kind of subjective experiences we have of the world and are making sense of the world, and also then how do we then collectively try to think of world building or world making with these kind of collective, from these various subjectivities in service of one another, as opposed to in service for ourselves. And I think that for me, there's, again, even in these paintings, it's the question of what kind of image, what kind of painting, what kind of experience can be generated from my knowledge and history in mark making, the kind of visual neologisms of mark making that I work with, meaning that I don't really think any mark is brand new, that most marks have been made before, but how you put those marks together can be something else, can be a newly invented language from, or not, you know, not purely new, because they're neologisms. They are made up of these parts of other forms of that language and that coda, the visual coda we know. And that we understand. And so you can see David Hammond's handprint that might look like a prehistoric handprint that could also form into a Guston arm, a Kara Walker silhouette to mark by me. And these coming together of these different things bring up different kind of collective pasts and collective understandings of an image. And where you're from and how you experience these is, again, super subjective, because whether you see incredible deep eroticism in these or violence or trauma is, I think, also dependent on how your brain and visual, you know, the visual histories that you have, but also the experiential histories that you have and come from. This last painting I made for the last room at the Whitney, it was only shown in the survey in the Whitney section. It was facing the Hudson River. It was in a room facing the Hudson River, and we decided to make it because you can't really show anything in that room if you're a painter or working on paper, because there's too much light. And so I made this and didn't do anything with it. Like, I didn't put it in anyone else's hands, and kept it so that we could show it there, and then you can do it, you know, sign all these forms and you can do what you want. But what it really provided was an opportunity to think, well, what do you make for that wall? Like, how do you approach this wall facing the water at the end of this exhibition, rather than just making that into this reading room or study room? And it became a really amazing opportunity to think through a lot of these kinds of images that I had been thinking about before. But clearly, when you look at this river and you look at the mouth of that river, I mean, we all think of the history of the city and the making of the city and the reason the city exists and how it exists, and the complete insane contradiction of what the Statue of Liberty suggests and means and is a symbol of, and how we have created that symbol in many ways, and this kind of mythology in that. And then the contradiction of how we are treating immigrants right now, or people who need the constructs of the idea of immigration, the constructs of the idea of the migrant, the construct of the idea of citizenship, and the kind of you know, insanity around that form of thinking and world making. And I think that for me, you know, it's not just this country that we're seeing this, but this is happening all through Europe. This was one of the main driving forces behind Brexit. This is something that you see all over the European Union because of the massive numbers of migrants that are trying to get into Europe as a result of various states of post-colonialism and violence and civil war that are taking place all over, you know. And so many are caused by our intrusion in these places, like Afghanistan and Iraq and the situation that grew in Syria, but also all over, West Africa. And all over from Ethiopia, from Kenya, from Tanzania. We have migrants that are all coming to these positions in the north parts of Africa, trying to get to Europe. This is an image of the Raft of Medusa, Géricault's famous painting that he did to show who he was in Paris in the salons. And he did this, he died when he was 35 after he finished this painting, which just blows my mind. But he did this painting based on this story of these Europeans that were desolate and desperate to get to a colony. And they were on a boat where the raft was this part of this boat that broke off. They were shipwrecked off of, I forgot, it's somewhere in North Africa. I forgot the islands that they were near. But what ends up happening, to me, what's fascinating, is that he studied the corpse to create this painting. And there's several Africans, 4. You don't see them unless you're there at the Louvre in person. 4 or 5 Africans actually in this painting, who are also, the African at the top waving the flag when they see this ship way in the distance. And what happened on this boat, the stories of cannibalism, the kind of traumatic mediated narratives that Géricault read about and wanted to create this painting as a statement to kind of carry this, make this kind of important historical painting. But to me what's really interesting is how much images from today's news cycle are the same of those images, but in reverse. And yet we are creating the same condition. Those of us, our ancestors who were those who went to colonies, and thus now create the situation where we will not admit. So that kind of repeat cycle has always been fascinating to me. There's not a particular positionality that this painting is trying to take, or a position. There's an embedded kind of emotional and visceral and experiential kind of intensity to the color and the drawing and the experience of the painting that comes out of these questions, that comes out of the kind of face of these contradictions, and that hopefully will be generative of a different kind of shift, even sensually, in who you are or who one is after the experience of the paintings. And I think that's the thing that drives me is what then can be generated from this situation. And it's not one of retreat or pessimism or, although I can be very pessimistic, but it's not one of, it's really, there is this aspect of kind of generative desire, and that comes from kind of a knowledge and history of understanding that, what Zora Neale Hurston said, how did she say it? She said something like, in the end, I forgot the exact words she used, but this idea that every effort was made to extinguish black life. Every effort was made to extinguish humanity. Every effort was made to deny humanity. And yet that has been one of the most vital, fundamental forms of generative creative work in this country and the narrative of this country, and unique kind of creative impulse in this country. To me, that's the contradiction that is something that I'm kind of constantly amazed by and find as a really inspiring place of making. And so I hope we can have the conversation around these ideas. How much time do we have? Am I done?
We have plenty of time.
Well, I wrote this small thing. They're called New Notes on Painting, and I just thought I would share them. I shared them before in our summoning, but if I have enough time, 5 minutes. Origins. Abstraction is a vehicle for complexity and unknowing and indeterminacy. A vehicle for speculative thought in the break or the glitch, ways of drawing and making sense of self, intentionally exploring contradictions inherent to the experience of democracy, violence, and racial capitalism and colonialism. Mumbling, murmurings, babbling, da-da, ha-ha. Abstraction is heritage, of the history of the visual, from Pharaoh to Babylon, the caves of Dunhuang, the Nazca lines of Peru, the pyramid of the sun and moon, out of the gaps and breaks of the fractal logic for West African textiles, Ethiopian illuminated manuscripts, the Vimalakutri Sutra, music, architecture, astrology, the history of Western painting, desire, failure, retreat, reinvention, creation of something else completely from all that. Abstraction is world making, an internal coherence, the layering, collective reiteration, mimetic negotiations in the Pan-African, Pan-Asian, Global South, cosmopolitan, failures of the trope of modernist progress, utopias and colonial thought, entropies like pandemic, blur, exodus, unknowing, uncertainty and precarity, political and social vertiginousness, mining the archives for speculative thoughts to unite, to untie limits and constraints, mining the all-world archive of Edward Glissant, get at the strangeness of the future image experience rather than habitually view and decipher, being cognizant of the reactive anxiety of challenges to white supremacy globally. Abstraction is a strategy. False binary, there's a false binary of abstraction and figuration, bound up with the modern colonial Eurocentric understanding of a nation state, one that destroys worlds, one that takes or finds potent forms of world making, one that captures and breaks them into categories of art, architecture, religion, science. Abstraction is a way around that, as a strategy of resistance against flattening, a refusal of description, of language, of containment, a breakdown of national identity, not being reduced to the body, the skin, a place, a language. Rather, a trajectory for a more complex and discursive creative project embedded in the all-world psyche. This is diaspora. It is a form of knowledge building, invention, from all drawn language, visual neologisms, a cycle of new vocabulary from past vocabulary. The pressure of our social, global, and planetary condition makes new meanings in the glitches between the marks of recall, remix, and fresh. Abstraction is the break, an alternative logic. Find that break, that gap, the fissures, undo and pull apart, an open force of unraveling possibility, an emergent logic, so that the absent image becomes a presence in its own right, so that the viewer and image are intertwined and indistinguishable. The presence of a ghost is paradigmatic, with ideology and myth structure itself, painting as performative time. How do we practice the continual release rather than venerate the incarceration of the fugitive? What if criticism, which refuses the separation of whatever it is that the artist does from whatever it is that the viewer does, is the devotional profanation of the sacred? That's a quote from Fred Moten. Abstraction is erasure. The erasure becomes a mark. Spray-colored ink, then erased. Erasure can be the most solid parts, more insistent than even the insistent marks, ghosts of the blurred image underneath. Erasure is mining, as excavation, that place of centuries past, but also emergent visual neologisms, since every mark has been made before, every gesture not new, every mark a copy, copying, a theft, remix. Is erasure, as the insistence of invention, wrangling something else from a shared and coded language, the spirit medium of the communal? Abstraction is mining the surround. Mark it, wipe it away, remark, but still an insistence on being, in existing through erasure, as in I am present, I am here, hineni. Mine for resources, for parts to a future, is a time-based emergent experience. Abstraction is the glitch. Abstraction is in the glitch. Lose my sense in my hands and materiality, allowed me to mark and erase back to front. That's important, the inability to fully see, but to feel, to lean hard on intuition, to trust the hand backwards. A mining for marks and signs and thoughts, floating in the medium of billions of years of mark making. Push, cut, scratch, stay, premonition, draw faster, last chance, oral clue. Serve intuition, impulse, improvisation. It is symptomatic. Prove it futile, as futile as the marks themselves. The marks are comfortable with that. They create the headache. Thank you.
Spectacular.
Thank you.
Now, I know that this was supposed to go until, was it 7:30? Who is the organizer? Until 8. So we have
Sorry, I took
time
too
then.
long.
No, the opposite. I mean, we want to keep on going. Great. I was going to tell people, yes, feel free to leave if you want to leave. The two of us will stay. Julie. So let me say, I actually had a few points I wanted to cover. But before that, you know, I was taken by your description of the fact that you don't have an internal representation of a painting that you want to make. But you simply, in essence, let the narrative take you. And the work itself guide where you are going. Don't tell me, because that's what I thought you said.
That is what I said. Kind
Excellent. Okay. The sounded more like, what is he talking about?
No,
All right.
yeah. Kind
we
of.
agree.
Yeah.
Now, now, you know, your paintings, you know, show how art can depict social injustice, violence, chaos, racial discrimination, the fight for freedom, and so forth. But at the same time, it brings humanity into our lives, the observers. Now, it's horrendous to admit and recognize that we're living in such difficult times that you have plenty of material to choose from.
Yeah.
And I wish that wasn't the case. But given that it is the case, what are you working on? What do you see as that next narrative
It's interesting.
in your work?
I think it like certain images or certain experiences come back to me, and they kind of start nagging at me internally and haunting me, and you know, coming to me when I wake up in the morning or in the middle of the night or when I'm taking a shower or whatever. It comes, they kind of these repetitive thoughts around an idea, or and maybe sometimes it's around a certain visuality, but it becomes a certain kind of image or experience. And you know, I don't really see the paintings before I make them, but there's interesting explorations, like points of departure that become these exploratory spaces, and then through that, the history of that exploration, then you can really generate something else. And that's when it gets really exciting, when I could go from these very large architectural paintings that became more and more complex, and the marks could eventually just jump off them and create a urban experience just by how the marks interact, or kind of conflate an experience in the forest with an urban experience, and how that could be. And so, to me, those became really interesting spaces to investigate, and then those led to other spaces, like the desire for the blurred photograph as this social kind of ground, but also when you blur a photograph, you don't really see it, you can't decipher it, it's illegible, but you get a certain kind of sense from it, a certain, like the haunting of the photograph, the kind of ghosts of the photograph, the light, the color, the time of day, all of this informs if it's a nighttime photograph to a daytime photograph. What are the colors of the lights? Are they, you know, white and blue and red and orange flames, or red flames, or are they all of this violets that they inform? So the painting, the last painting I made after the raft, that painting was really informed by these two major photographs that were used, two major anti-immigration rallies. One was a major Brexit rally, and another one was a major rally in Chemnitz, Germany, which was really, you know, so the oranges and the reds and all of that informs that. But that creates also then a different kind of, we respond socially to that palette in a very particular way because of our knowledge of, our experience of those image, that kind of an image. So we can't read the image, right, but we experience it in that way. And so now I think I'm like really interested in what happens in the darkness in those spaces. And I don't know, like I'm exploring two types of things in the paintings. One where you can actually see through the painting at times, and then others where they're made from this very dark, we start with black, and then the colors and what happens in that space.
Wow. Now, let me ask you a question that I've actually gotten asked multiple times by my colleagues here.
Okay.
In the couple of talks and meetings you've had. And it's a question of scale. All right? I want to bring it back a little bit into the science component, but just a tiny bit. Now, you create these, you know, monumental pieces, just starting with marks. Now, if you take the example of, I think the largest you probably made is the Goldman piece. Yeah, single piece, 80 feet long or so. Now, you look at that painting from across the street, and it's a fully coherent piece. It's an extraordinary piece. Okay? But you can now go into that image, and let's say that you fracture it. You could do it into lots of tiny pieces, and there is no question, certainly in my mind, that each of those can be its own painting. So here you have 80 feet, and when I fracture it into 1,000 pieces, each one, you know, and my goodness, I'll take any of those pieces home and say, oh my God, here is a Mehretu. All right. Now, in science, the eye and the visual system have captured and marveled the imagination of entire generations of scientists. You know, how do you ultimately create and perceive an image? Now, take the fruit fly. You know, we tend to use animal models for a lot of our work. It's a lot easier to deal with them than with graduate students, colleagues, postdocs. Yeah? Now, a fruit fly has 1,000. A fruit fly has 800, but a typical fly, has 1,000 plus individual eyes. You've seen these little pictures, eh? Now, it turns out that the fly is not seeing 1,000 images of Julie's painting. Each of those unit eyes is capturing one small fraction of the whole, and then the brain puts it together. Now, here you have it. You know, where is Charles going with this? You might be wondering. Okay. So here you have this monumental 80 feet long by, I don't know, 70 feet tall. I forgot the exact dimensions.
Yeah, it's something 23.
Yeah, 23. Yeah. How did you do it? I don't mean physically. I know you rented a church, but how do you work in the piece in a way that your brain, your visual system, and you're working right there in front of it, yeah?
Yes.
Ultimately accommodates this discrepancy between where are you going and what ends up being the piece.
I mean, okay, so that painting is, in a way, I had an idea. So we had to make it I had to make it somewhere where we could keep it. Like, we had to be able to work on the whole thing. You couldn't work on it in parts and then put it together. So we went to Berlin because we could find a big, huge studio there for very little. I had been in residency there. I'd done a residency there before. And we took, we basically stretched the painting, and we found a place where this huge kind of old munitions factory where you could walk in, where I'd walk in every day, and I would walk past the painting as one would, coming from the subways, into this building to experience this. And then when I would leave that evening, I would always leave the same way, like the opposite. And so this directional experience of the painting was really interesting to me. And I worked on it almost a year and a half, almost 2 years. And that physical kind of experience of having to, that durational experience of working on something at this scale, that's what it requires. But also something else happens when you do that. It becomes more like, I think novels can take a lot longer, but if you compare it to the practice of writing, I think that you could have some novelists that can work really fast, but the novel there's something else happens in that time-based, durational kind of way of approaching making. And so for me, I think there's that experience. But we have these tools like computers, like you guys. So we use them to to look at things in detail and then be able to look at things from a distance. You can't do that in space. And in the past, they would use a camera obscura or whatever 400 years, 300 years ago. We would use, I can take a photo with my iPhone. I mean, at that point, iPhones weren't very good. This was 2008, 2009. But you could take photos. We'd take really good digital photos, and we put them in the computer, and I had this big screen, and I could actually look at the painting this small. I could look at it, at this scale, and then I could really zoom in on certain parts. But the zooming in wasn't so important in the computer. The interest of the computer was how to see it in a different way. And I'd have the computer right there in front of the painting, so I could look at it in scale.
As a whole.
Yes, and then we had projectors that we would attach to the computers, so I had 5 projectors, one for each panel, and you could actually project and see certain things. So I came to Berlin all smart, thought I had the whole painting mapped out for all the colored shapes, and we would get this done easily in a year. And I projected that, and it completely fell apart, and that was my first lesson in scale. Because you see it here doesn't mean it'll work on that scale. So then I had to reduce it, erase all those layers in the computer to one layer at a time. I started with one kind of mapping and charting that we painted across the entire painting. It took us almost 9 months to paint all of the geometric shapes and the layers of that in the painting, including maybe more like 7 months. And then after that, it took almost the same amount of time for a group of 30 people to work on the architectural tracing that went into the painting. And again, this was done, I didn't know what part would go where, and one building would be projected here, another bit there, and then later I'd want to change the space, and so there's this constant physical engagement with it, and visual engagement with it, but then there's the space of retreat into this into this virtual space of being able to see something at a very small scale, and then you could really zoom in also. But that interest of what you described as this capability of fracturing something to all these different scales, that became really interesting to me about that wall. That's the reason I took the commission in the first place, was when can you give painting the privilege, really a painting on canvas, which is a different thing than a mural. It's a different thing than a wall drawing. It's a different thing than a fresco. These are all different kinds of practices and ways of making. But how could a painting like that, layered and being able to be made like a painting at a smaller scale that's usually inside of museum institutions, if it's at all a public space, how can this be somewhat of a public work of art, in that it faces the bike path, it faces the West Side Highway, it faces the World Trade Center site. But at the same time, it's on the actual fortification of the building. It's on the blast wall for this building that only exists because of the timing and the time that this building was being built and the form of the building that it was. So the painting was considering all of these different contradictions again, these different realities, and the capability of the painting to be able to be fractured into little bits was really important to me. So there are parts of that painting that I also am that I find that I'm kind of connected to in a deeper way, certain parts than others. I have my favorite little moments that I still try to deal with, or that haunt me still in the way that I paint. But so that was one of the approaches. Also conceptually, I think, embedded in the desire of the effort of the painting was is this idea of play of scale, so that when you're really up close to it, what is happening in the big painting is not important. It's the experience of what's happening up close. Yeah, and this is something of how we make sense of ourselves in space and time and history and the moment and futures.
You know, unrelated, free associations. You know, our National Youth Poet Laureate, Amanda Gorman, in one of her talks makes this, you know, wonderful statement. And she talks about making a crack on the, you know, existing narrative to see what blooms. I mean, it's so extraordinarily poetic, yeah? And to some degree, this notion here again, yeah, of how you can crack, deconstruct something, and then out of that emerges, you know, a new narrative. I thought that.
Yeah, and Doris Salcedo, this Colombian artist, did this in the Tate. She put this enormous crack into the concrete turbine hall floor and built this entire, you know, growing kind of scape out of that physically. Really did what Amanda Gorman describes. But also, I think, yeah, fundamentally, that's one of the experiences of being the enslaved, is the place of finding the breaks, in those breaks finding a form of emancipation and possibility. And that's still how I think we, you know, try to make sense of possibilities. And I'm curious, like, how that is also
encoded in the brain.
Yeah, I feel, well, but also with the exploration of all of the all of you that I've met here, who are mining the space of unknowing, or mining the space of whatever, and then looking in these breaks, looking in what are the unknowns in those moments. But also to get answers to,
yes,
you know, unanswerable questions in a way.
You expect an answer from that? Yeah. you know what drives us? You know, for many of us, being a scientist is not a job, it's not a career, it's a vocation. No, it flows in our veins. Like you have no choice but to paint. Many of us have no choice but to do everything we can to discover the undiscovered. That is what drives us. Yeah? And for nearly everyone in this building, by the way, we have around 900 people that work in this building, 50 different research groups. Our goal is to uncover the mysteries of the brain. You know, how you transform the human condition.
Yeah.
Now, many of us, you know, work on molecules and cells and circuits. But ultimately, we want to understand what makes us human. You know, how you go from sadness to happiness. You know, what is the brain neural basis of creativity? I have no idea. What's even worse, I don't even know how you would approach that problem. And so what we do here, this is kind of a way around your question, is we pick tractable problems. We pick problems that could be very complex, but are solvable or approachable, and they give us a window into the brain. You know, I work on the taste system, but not because I necessarily care to see how different foods taste. We use the taste system as a window into the brain. So how you transform detection into perception. Now, taste is particularly attractive because it's extraordinarily altered by your internal state. When you're hungry, when you're sated. How can your perceptions change when you're happy, when you're unhappy? Taste memories, I show you that bat, yeah? Once all it took. And so the amount of unknowns in how the brain works vastly exceeds, of course, what we know. And so some of the issues that, you know, you're thinking about, you know, it'll be wonderful if ultimately, remember the language is the brain, are electrical signals. And here we have a problem, yeah? The world is made of real things. You know, this is a real Julie here, yeah? This is a table. This is a chair. This is real. But our brain only interprets electrical signals. So how do you transform, yeah, what we call this reality into an internal representation that's based on nothing but signals to make us human? Yeah? Now, that's certainly what many of us ultimately want to accomplish. And what your work does for many of us, certainly me, is to further appreciate the extent to which human creativity and ingenuity and art itself can so profoundly affect us. And so, this is not the end, but I still want to thank you. Yeah?
Thank you.
For what you do.
Thank you.
And I want a tiny little piece of that big fracture. Now, you know, part of the goal of this get-together here, and we can talk about so many, you know, I'm from Chile, so I experienced personally not only the turmoil before Pinochet, during Pinochet, after Pinochet, social, you know, injustice, and, you know, the full, you know, gamut of challenges of being in Latin America. That's where my accent comes from. It comes from, in case you wonder. Eh? Where is he from? You know, what language is he speaking? But part of what we wanted to do here, rather than, you know, we can go on the world, the challenges. You know, it's to get a little bit of your take on your internship.
Yeah.
You know, perhaps some reflections, yeah, on you having visited and met with good. I mean, you met almost half of the scientists at the group leaders at the institute. And you know, what are your impressions? How certainly they have enriched our.
So I think first you should extend the residency maybe another 5 years.
Very good.
Then we can really do a project. It was actually.
By the way, let me answer that by telling you, we agree. I mentioned this before. I would be happy to do that if you agree to take me as your scientist in residence.
Yeah,
in your
for sure.
studio. Okay, go ahead.
But I think, yeah, for me, what was really. It's such, you know, artists are used to going to visit other artists and doing studio visits and understanding, trying to make sense of what somebody's doing, and they explain. So this was an experience of basically lab visits, like studio visits, but with scientists. And it was, and each one had this presentation or kind of way to present to me what the work was that they were doing and the inventions of that and the kind of immense creative work that's required to like think of these questions and initiate the questions, but then also to investigate these questions, like in creating these experiments. And so I think I'm still so taken by kind of the immense possibilities of what can come out of this kind of work, but also the immense horror that can come out of this work, right? So it's, and I think that's one of the fundamental kind of contradictions that we're immersed in, not because knowledge is power, knowledge is capability, knowledge is essential. Thank you. But also, like, knowledge can easily be so co-opted. And there's the more and more that I think we learn about behavior and, you know, what you described, the more that certain kinds of certain kind of abuse can happen, right? Like and so there's this really interesting place of how do you protect and at the same time develop, like and learn. And so I was really interested in that. But then I was also interested in the infrastructural way of doing these experiments that almost every scientist here and every laboratory has a panopticon, has a form of a panopticon, a form of that sense of study, which is fascinating, right? Like visually beautiful, really interesting structures like Dimitri's.
Yeah, I should put a clip of that.
Because it's such an interesting image of
because
this.
I remember you loved it, so I think people will enjoy it.
Or
we are almost out of time.
who was it? Rudy's
okay,
fruit
we could
fly?
Should we put one clip for 30 seconds?
Just look at one panopticon.
Yes?
It's incredible.
Oh, all right. You have been voted down now.
That's my joke. Anyway, it's been an incredible experience, and I think I wish that
Let me see if I can find it.
there wasn't a pandemic, and that there could have actually been a project that could have evolved from the meetings and from in a kind of creative project. You know, either like as a kind of thought experiment with like my group of people at Denison Hill to really investigate some of these ideas and to play with like creating an art piece out of these kinds of like something out of it. I don't even haven't even conceptualized it, but that would be really interesting. That's why we need more time.
Sure, yeah.
That's my argument.
But oh, I see. We only put it in the room. Very good. Can you? So this is a clip of work done by one of our scientists in here, a brilliant young man. His name is Dmitry Aronov, and he's trying to understand how memories are created, stored, and recalled. And one of the tricks that we scientists use to uncover the mysteries of the brain is to choose models that do that task so incredibly well that then the job of discovering how it works becomes easier. Make sense? Now, it turns out that food storing is a strategy used by many animals to deal with future shortages in food supply. And there is a small number of bird families, and I think this clip here are chickadees, that scatter their food. So this is an arena that Dmitry developed. They scatter their food around multiple sites, and then they use episodic-like memories to find these sites later in time. Now, their capacity is nothing short of extraordinary. In fact, in the wild, these birds have been observed making nearly 5,000 distinct sites per day. And they precisely remember these locations more than a month later. So in this little arena that Dmitry created, you see the little bird, it takes a little food pellet, and it goes to any one of these random sites now to drop it and store it. Now, the animal then goes back and retrieves them. And so Dmitry's arena actually has been taken to the next step because he can now monitor what happens inside the brain of this bird while he's executing these acts. And in doing so, begin to uncover the logic by which these memories are created, stored, and then recalled.
But then this is a sculpture, too.
It is.
This
is art.
Because each of these dowels, you recognize those IKEA dowels, and then the leather patch, and then this bird is being watched by 6 cameras, 8 more cameras.
Multiple, yeah.
And so it has cameras from all these different directions that are watching and monitoring the behavior of this construct constantly. And that to me, I mean, I mentioned this before, but that's like a Paul Pfeiffer sculpture. I don't know if you know of the work of Paul Pfeiffer,
yes,
but it's so connected. And who's an artist who's very interested in like how we generate, like how behavior, what parts of our behavior are something that we've learned and developed, or are deeply something more kind of fundamental to we are chemically, like empathy. And,
for example, how do we, I mean, there are ways now to begin to study the neural basis of empathy.
Yeah.
You know, there are some, you can take a mouse and you can have him view another mouse that's unhappy. And now this animal will exhibit the hallmarks of what we might call empathy. If you could do that, now you can go into the brain of these animals and begin to ask, what changed? How did this happen? And so it is this the kind of stuff that ultimately we hope to make a real difference on. Now, I know we're out of time, but I will make one claim here. Julie has publicly agreed to stay an extra year. And so I will ensure that we have one more event that's only dedicated to conversation.
There you go.
No talks, no slides. So that we can take it from there. And on that note, I want to just acknowledge, there are many people to acknowledge, but in particular, first, Alan Kanzer, our benefactor and real force behind this entire program. Alan, if you're still there, thank you. And finally, I want to thank Paula Croxon, right here. Paula, please. Our Director of Public Programs. And Marjorie, is Marjorie around here? Marjorie Perez Richardson, she's not here, for making tonight's event possible. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Thank you.